Yeah. Come on.
So Wayne, did you say you'll send it along? Thank you.
Just did, yeah.
Yeah.
Going through the splash top is a little slow for me right now.
Oh, I can go. I have oh no.
I sent it, so.
Okay. Because I have Outlook. I do have Outlook running on my laptop. There's Meredith.
For the CPC members who are on the call right now, I just forwarded an email from Town Accountant Wendy Nightingale with the warrant article funding sources. For the CPC members who are on the call right now, I just forwarded an email from Town Accountant Wendy Nightingale with the warrant article funding sources.
Ed, is that the library at Borderland?
It just looks like it. It's actually someplace back in Europe.
It does kind of have a Knives Out vibe to it, doesn't it?
Yeah, it just looks like it. It's actually someplace back in Europe.
Someone else made that suggestion just last week.
Have you seen the new Knives Out movie, The Glass Onion?
Not yet. It is on the list, but
it's worth watching.
I've heard good things about it. I like the first one, so I'm pretty confident I'll really enjoy the second as well. It's got a really good cast.
The new Knives Out movie, The Glass Onion?
Not yet. It is on the list.
So the rule is 15 minutes for a full professor and 2 minutes for a chairman?
Good things about it. I like the first one, so I'm.
What if you're not a professor at all?
What?
What if you're not a professor at all?
You just don't show up. That's all on those cases.
I think he's going to show up.
We have a quorum.
We do.
We will with Tom for sure. So John's not joining us, or Dennis Sheedy, or Greg.
So we have 5.
Bennett and Ian.
We got 5 now, so we're legal.
Yeah.
So
And here's Tom.
OBS does not seem to be getting the video from Zoom. I'm not seeing a screen, but it's recording internally in Zoom. So,
Hey team,
Hello.
how is everybody?
Good.
Thank you so much for your patience. Apologies for being late. You'd think in this virtual world, having meetings that go back to back, we're able to get to them. but quite frankly, you still need a couple minutes in between.
Yeah, I can't see
All right.
anything.
First off, let me read the remote meeting procedures. That in keeping with an act relative to extending certain state of emergency accommodations, this meeting will be conducted remotely over Zoom. Attendance by board commission members will be remote, and remote attendance shall count toward a quorum. Meeting may be broadcast live and will be recorded on ECAP. So, with that said, we do have a lighter team tonight. Certainly no less capable, but we do have a few folks that won't be able to make it. So I will take form. I'll just go around in the order that I have. Amanda Varela.
Present.
Meredith Keach.
Present.
Edmund Hands.
Present.
Al Benson.
Present.
Mr. Jim Lee.
Here.
And Tom Broussard is also here.
Oh,
Awesome. Thank you. And again, I apologize for being a few minutes late, team. So hopefully everybody got the agenda for tonight. In terms of a discussion, Stephanie, I think Wendy will be joining us to give us
Wendy is here.
Excellent.
Oh, in OBS. Okay.
Perfect. We will also be discussing the funding sources for confirming in terms of items that we've already approved to include and recommend. We do have two additional articles that we need to vote and recommend on if we so choose. One is additional reserves. So the good news is we got extra money from the state. As a requirement, we have to allocate 10% of the receipts to the respective required CPA reserve accounts. So that's one article. The second article is the budget article, the CPA fiscal year 24 budget article. So those are two items for discussion and vote to recommend. Then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 projects to confirm funding source. We'll have a very brief update regarding talking about fiscal year 25. So not even done 24 yet. Credit to Wayne and Stephanie, already pushing us to 25. Well done. And before I do that, I do just want to accept the minutes of February 23rd, regular session. Unless anybody has any issues or edits to those, I would take a motion to accept.
So moved.
Second.
I think there was a tie for first, so I'll go with Ed and Jim, and then around the horn, Jim, Al,
Aye.
Ed,
Aye.
Meredith,
Aye.
Amanda,
Aye.
and Tom Broussard is also an aye. Perfect. So next up, world famous financial circle extraordinaire Wendy Nightingale to have a conversation with us about the current state of the CPA budget overview and discussion. Thank you in advance, Stephanie, Wayne, and Wendy. Now that I see you join, this is a perfect time as we're about to embark on confirmation of funding sources to kind of have a good in-depth understanding of where we are now financially and what our options might be in terms of funding. Hey, Wendy.
Hey, how are you?
Great, thanks. Good to see you. This is a perfect.
Thanks for having me.
Embark on confirmation of funding sources to kind of have a
So,
understanding of.
I prepared a presentation, so we could go through that, and then we could go through the articles afterwards. That works for you?
That's perfect.
Okay.
And when you say go through the articles, you mean from a funding perspective?
Yes.
Perfect.
We could go through that, and then we could go through the articles afterwards. That works here on my screen.
That's perfect. And when you say go through the articles, you mean from a funding perspective?
Yes. So I figure we'll start out by going through the budget and what the estimated revenues are for fiscal 24. We're estimating a surcharge of $1,685,000. State trust fund distribution of $500,000. Investment income of $50,000 for a total of $2,230,230. $235,000. Estimating a surcharge. Basically, once you set that estimate, then you can look at, okay, what are my minimum 10%? What's my cap for my admin fees? So those have been set on the next page. So this sort of lays out everything. You got the $2,235,000 up here. Basically, 5% of that is $111,750. So you can allocate that for admin. Your debt service is $601,585 for next year. That includes the second portion of the town hall debt. So we bonded the town hall debt. That project was $1,450,000, and we bonded that in basically like 2 increments. The second increment, we just did the bond issue. The proceeds came in today, so that is included in that total. Annual budgeted reserve, we can get back to that. And the Affordable Housing Trust, so that's your 10%. And that's assuming you're gonna transfer it all into the Affordable Housing Trust. If you don't transfer it into the trust, you would just have to reserve the difference and set that aside for community housing. So what I did is after you take those amounts for your admin, your debt, and your Affordable Housing Trust, then I looked at, what's left, right? You have a pretty significant budget for fiscal 24. So, and based on the projects that have been approved, you could really fund most of them out of your revenues for fiscal 24. So that's what I did here. Now, in some cases, you had some other reserves and other surplus balances that could also be used towards these articles. And so in order to use those up, that's why you see some of these other columns here. So Article 15, which would be so you've got Article 13 for the town meeting warrant, which is basically the budget. Article 14 is Affordable Housing Trust. Article 15 is the Governor Ames carriage house renovation. So that was $276,000. That's a historic project. There was $47,570 in historic reserves. So rather than use up all of the money from the estimated budget from next year, we'll use up that reserve and then take the balance from your estimated revenues for fiscal 24. And again, these are funding sources that I'm proposing. We can certainly discuss that. If you feel different and you want to change that, well, those can be changed as well. They're not etched in stone. These are really my recommendations. Design, that can come out of your annual revenues. The town hall landscape rehabilitation plan for $60,000. There were 2 articles. There were older articles that were set aside for town meeting for town hall that had surplus balances that hadn't been spent. And so what I would propose is that you would just use up those articles toward this particular appropriation. And so that's what this surplus article balance column is for $60,000. The tennis and basketball courts. So I know there was some discussion, if it's over $1 million, should we borrow it or should we, use available funds? I think because this year you don't have, well, you do have one big project, but in terms of all the others, you could certainly afford to take a lot of this, and I would recommend that you do that out of your estimated revenues for next year. And then to minimize what you do borrow, because interest rates are certainly higher now than they were. I would recommend funding all of that project from available funds and not borrowing for that. So that would mean taking the balance take $850,000 out of the unreserved fund balance to do that.
Which is, am I wrong, 6.3 million, the unreserved fund balance?
Yes, in fact, I have a slide that will get to that.
Perfect.
So 850,000 from reserve fund balance, and then 3.5 million for the playground project. I would recommend borrowing for that. You could, appropriate more fund balance if you wanted to do that, if you didn't want to borrow so much. But right now I'm proposing that you would just borrow for the whole project.
Wendy, can you, I'm sorry, Tom, go ahead. I should have asked.
That's okay. Go ahead, Meredith, you go first.
Just wondering if you could, especially with this recorded, if anybody watches that, can you walk through how money is borrowed?
So, well, the only way you can borrow money, first of all, you need a town meeting appropriation in order to do that. And when we borrow money, we issue bonds. And the amount of years that you pay back those bonds depends on what's allowed per Mass General Law. So in this case, the playground would be like a recreational facility. The limitation on those are like 15 years. So I would estimate, in fact, I did some estimations, 340,000 over 15 years. That's what I would project the annual debt service to be. And that's conservative. That's based on like a 5% interest rate.
You good, Meredith?
Did that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. It's just a question I don't think people fully understand. If anybody wanted to understand, how that's done when you borrow the money, I think it's an important piece to just explore for folks a little bit. 5% is actually great right now. So.
We actually just did a bond issue. It was like $10 million, and our net interest cost was 3.63%. So, certainly hoping that, it's not going to be 5%. And any premium that we get that reduces that interest cost will be offset against the par amount of the bonds. In fact, that happened with, included in that $10 million was the other half of the town hall project. So that was 600,000, and the principal ended up getting reduced by the premium we received to 571,000. So you're able to apply 29,000 against that.
So Wendy, I'm being thoughtful about, you might have slides that come up. What slides do you have come up? And then if they address the question, I won't take your time now. What slides do you have coming up? Will you be going through like the debt schedule, what rolls off for debt? Will you help? Got it, okay.
I have some information on debt, show you what the projected fund balance will be at the end of this fiscal year. It's not a lot of slides, so.
Good, I'll let you go. I just want to make sure the team appreciates what is rolling off of bonding debt, that, like, for example, Dean Street, and then what might be coming on. Looks like in FY27 there's an open space small item that's coming on, but I'll let you go through. If it covers that, then I'll just have a few more questions regarding borrowing cost, reserve fund usage. And actually, credit to Al, Stephanie, and Wayne. They've been focusing on a list of projects that are either complete or inactive that at last check equaled $360,000. So I guess where I'm going with it is I don't want to borrow at elevated interest rates to the except to the smallest extent possible that we all agree to. Having a reserve fund balance is part of the reason why you do things like this, so you don't have to necessarily partake in bonds and debt at high interest rates. So I just want to balance that. So I'll let you finish this discussion, then we can circle back to those points if that's okay.
So the other line here that I didn't really cover, I kind of skipped over it, was the annual budgeted reserve. You could certainly opt not to have an annual budgeted reserve. You could apply that to the playground project and fund it, that way, or use that in a combination of, it's kind of an odd number. So you can use a combination of unreserved fund balance if you wanted to take that number plus some more unreserved fund balance and, knock the 3.5 borrowing down to 3.
Yeah, but I think also just in terms of good due diligence, if we did not have a budgeted reserve, does that go directly in the budget reserve, or is that the funds that we get to use? No, that's the administrative expenses.
Right, the administrative expenses,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, I got
For
confused.
lack of a better word, honestly, the annual budgeted reserve it's kind of a plug. That is basically in between what your estimated revenues are and what your appropriations are. And the purpose of that is that if during the year you had something come up, and I mean, in our case, it's probably not as much of a big deal because the fund balance, the unreserved fund balance, is so high. But if you didn't have that, then this annual budgeted reserve becomes an additional funding source during the year, after you set your tax rate.
Yep. Understood. But to your point, I think you're onto something. You add that 292, you add it to 358 that exists in complete or inactive projects. Then you potentially leverage a little bit of your unreserved. All of a sudden, you're not borrowing $3.5 million. You could really conceivably be looking at borrowing maybe half that. All right, understood. Thanks so much.
So speaking of debt service, this is all the debt service that we have going on now. And this also includes what the estimate is for the playground at the 3.5 million in the fiscal 2025 column. So, of particular note, the Dean Street land, that's going to be paid off in 2026. That's going to take 106,000, out of that total. And then in fiscal 24, Governor Ames, that's paid at the end of next fiscal year. So in fiscal 25, that's going to go away. So in fiscal 24, your debt service is going to be 601,000. It will go to 887,000 potentially with a new project. And after in fiscal 2027, that would drop down to about 777,000. So you will have an offset just a few short years away.
And so, team, what I'll do is, do you mind toggling back, Wendy, to your first slide? Just for context,
This one or?
This one's fine. So for context, $2.2 million worth of appropriations at the $777,000 level, you're basically looking at 1/3 of your annual revenues being allocated to the service of debt. That doesn't make it good or bad, but it's just letting you know that right out of the gate, 1/3 of your spending ability is servicing past commitments. Now, I will, if you want to go to the next slide, Wendy, I'll come off as being smart financially, but this is all Wendy from previous. So credit to you. But for every $1 million worth of debt service at a 5% assumption, it's about $100,000. And so to me, why that's important is you'll pick up $500,000 worth of debt service and still be equal in 2025. And then in 2026, when you make that final payment on Dean Street, again, that's worth roughly another $1 million of debt service. So in theory, we could pick up $1.5 million of debt service this year, and by 2026, be back to our debt service level of 2024, which is $600,000. I'm not trying to confuse you. I'm just pointing out that if you have $1.5 million of debt that we take on this year, it gets back to normal in 2026.
I totally agree with that.
Wendy, could you help us out with the difference in the deposit rate and the borrowing rate?
The borrowing rate is definitely going to be a lot higher than our deposit rate, and to be honest, you have to be careful with that anyway when you're dealing with like borrowing proceeds and investing that. But I don't know if that's really what you're getting at, or just.
I think there's an incremental cost associated with borrowing, because we can't, if we keep the money, we're not going to earn anywhere near that. If we pay it off, there's a net savings to the difference between the borrowing rate and the deposit rate. So we're going to save that by not borrowing as much.
Right. Down to you know, what could potentially come up, because obviously if you borrow money, then even though you're committing some of your budget in future years, you're also not using up all the, you know, the money that you have now. So you can leverage more debt. You know, if something big comes up, because I know, you know, you have your priority parcels, and if anything really large came up, you don't necessarily want to spend all of your available funds. Because the other thing too is when you go to borrow, bond counsel requires financial projections, and they do not allow you to put in an estimate for the state trust fund distribution. So you have to be able to fund that debt service on pretty much the surcharge alone.
Mm-hmm. Meredith, you have a question?
Yeah. Forgive me if this is not germane, but I was asked recently, is there something that's supposed to happen with the Shovel Works project where we're supposed to get money that comes in? And I don't know if it's something that CPC gets or not. So I just figured I'd ask while I have you here. And could that positively impact this situation too?
Absolutely. So when the Shovel Works project was approved, one of the financing mechanisms was a loan. And so they have an outstanding loan with the town, with the Community Preservation Fund, of $4,350,000. That matures. In March of 2031. So that's 8 years from now. But basically 8 years, you got, you know, 4.3 million coming back to the fund. They also pay 3% interest every year. They don't, and the payment is dependent on the cash flow. There was a very complex agreement that was signed by the town. But basically, if they don't have enough cash flow to pay the interest, then it just keeps accruing. And they're finally getting to the point where those interest payments, or those distributions that go toward the accumulated interest, are now exceeding what is accruing for interest on an annual basis. So this fiscal year, we got $390,000 for an interest payment, which went into the CPA fund. At some point, you know, that accrued interest, there won't be so much of it, so that will be paid off, and they could probably get down to start paying off the principal.
Okay, so let me just recap to make sure that I kind of have my bearings here. So theoretically, we could use everything we have to pay for what's in front of us. But if we do that, that could put us in, obviously, would use all reserves. And so, you know, that makes me concerned. And if we do utilize debt service bonding, we're going to be in a much, for 2 years, we'll be, you know, not in an amazing shape, but in 2026, we will be in better shape. And then as of 2031, we're going to be in great financial shape. Theoretically, we'll have access to 4 million. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay,
Yep.
Thank you.
And I would say, Wendy, you guys can correct me if you're wrong, but we're in really great financial shape overall. We have a really strong unreserved balance, Meredith, that positions us to be very flexible and have discretion over what I would say materially large potential CPC projects in the future. So, and to your point, we'll get in 2031, we have a really large chunk of money coming our way, and I think it wouldn't use all of our reserve funds if we wanted to pay all of this in cash this year, but there is thoughtful utilization of debt, to your point, whereby in 2 years, if we're back to the existing debt levels and it doesn't deplete our reserves, to Wendy's point that she appropriately pointed out, those reserves enable us to continue to be able to leverage a bonding mechanism, because that's what they look at in terms of good stability, and I guess I call it a good balance sheet. Is that a simple way to explain it, Wendy?
Yes, that's great.
Thank
So like
you.
if we went to zero on our reserve balance, we wouldn't have the flexibility to go out and get more debt if a very priority parcel comes up.
Okay.
So it's kind of like why you want to have savings, because you might have to put 20% down on a house someday.
Got it.
You gotta keep that.
You're speaking my language. Thank you.
Right? There you go. Know your
Right.
audience. I'm with you.
Yep. Okay, so, and right now, the total principal on all the debt that's outstanding is about 4.6 million. So if you add 3.5 million, that brings you to about 8 million. And that Shovelworks loan principal is 4,350,000. Your undesignated fund balance as of July 1st, 2022 was 6.2 million, which is fantastic. If you apply that 850,000 for the playground, tennis courts, and you take that out, that's a significant amount. However, the projected year-end surplus as of this June is going to be like, I mean, you're looking at at least like 600,000, and you know, that's my conservative estimate. So I'm sure it's going to be more, and that's really based on, you know, what we've collected so far in revenue. So, you know, that is probably going to be more, but that's going to put you back to 6 million at the end of the fiscal year.
Wendy, could you tell us how much that 6.2 or 6 million is earning at present?
It varies. It's invested in a firm that we have called Bartholomew Investments. They've done very well for us.
But could you tell me the interest rate, please?
I don't have the exact interest rate because it's a mix of investments. And I will say that this year, the returns have not been so good.
Right.
So it's probably not earning, like if you look at this year, it's probably a very, very low percentage.
0.5%?
Al, for context, the budget that was presented has
Probably.
for 24 has $50,000 worth of interest on $6 million worth of balance.
That's less than 1%.
Right? So.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Is that okay, Wendy, for proxy?
Yes. So again, $6 million, you certainly could use more of this toward the playground project if you wanted to. It's just, you know, your call as a committee.
Mm-hmm.
I will say, just, you know, I know there's been a lot of talk about town projects and, you know, having skin in the game, and you know, why come to community preservation committee if it's a town project? You should be funding it through your own process. And I just wanted to point out just make some points about the town's, you know, finances as a whole. First of all, the community preservation fund, it really is great for us to have this because it does complement the resources that we have for those, you know, certain needs that meet the standard for the fund. And because we have the fund, we're able to fund projects that would probably otherwise be deferred or you know, pared down so that it would, you know, to a lesser dollar amount. Like for example, the playground, you know, that's an enormous cost. We would not be able to fund that without the community preservation fund. Town operating and capital resources are constrained as it is. You know, we have, if you've ever listened to Connor Reed's budget message, like every year, he always says, you know, we have the structural revenue deficit, and it's true that we do. Our revenue growth is very limited, and so every year there's always a certain amount of that difference between your estimated revenues and your appropriations for your budgets that has to be filled with like your one-time money or free cash. And that free cash could otherwise be used for capital. And we're not, why is that? And it's not because that we, spend a lot of money, but our revenue growth is very, very limited. Annually, you're looking at growth of probably like around 2.75%. So it's less than 3% every year. Partly because of the limitations of Prop 2.5. But the big factor that really causes us issues is state aid to cities and towns, or state aid to Easton for education aid, is extremely limited. We're what they call a minimum aid community. So you get $30 a student for an increase in our state revenue over the previous year. That's nothing. It's kind of insulting. There's a lot of communities that are, certainly in that same boat with us, but when you look at the tax levy is your largest source of revenue for the general fund, followed by state aid. The only piece you have left are your local receipts, and even though they do fairly well, it's only around $7 million. So it's a small percentage of the revenue as a whole. The other thing that limits us, state aid for Chapter 90 funding for roads. They've been level funding that for years. 700,000, for the whole town, and there was a time where we were supplementing that with capital requests of 500,000, because really what we need to do is spend about that, over $1 million a year. And we were having to borrow for that, but we just couldn't keep borrowing for that. So we have to take a few years where we took a break from that. So that makes things difficult. And, our capital needs for this year alone, the requests are $10 million. And, we're certainly not going to be able to fund all of that, or probably even a fraction of that. The needs in the town are really great. So to be able to have the community preservation fund is just huge help to cover some of these costs. So we appreciate that you fund these projects. And, we would certainly love to be able to fund them out of the operating budget so that you could fund other projects. But, at the end of the day, without the CPA funding, that just means that more things will get deferred and not funded.
Appreciate the presentation, Wendy, and the additional commentary on the overall economic status of the town. Team, any questions on the presentation from Wendy in terms of the numbers, the details? And Wendy, if it's okay, I might ask you to go back just a slide or two. Go back one more. So yeah, probably right here is perfect. At least to help us see what the projects are and the funding. So to me, I think it's a balance between being thoughtful on how much debt we're incurring and at the elevated interest rates, but at the same point preserving a very healthy reserve balance. There are a couple of items that I think seem to be low-hanging fruit. I do want to ask the process for this, Stephanie, you might know best. But if we identified $358,000 worth of remaining balance for projects that are complete or inactive, what's the mechanism to get that $358,000 back into our coffers? Oh, you're muted.
So technically it never leaves your coffers, but it does kind of hang out there assigned to the particular project. So it's the process that we've already started where we go through the list, determine what projects have been completed or are not going to move forward. And then we let Wendy know, probably in some like a formal memo that the funds should be returned back to the general unreserved balance or reserves.
Okay.
Does that make sense, Wendy?
Yes, yep.
So it's not a town vote or anything like that?
No, it does not need a town vote.
Okay. So team, happy to hear thoughts, but where I'm leaning towards is making sure we take any of those projects that are completed, that's roughly $358,000, and getting that back into our unreserved balance. Secondly, would be instead of allocating an annual budgeted reserve of $291,735 that goes into the reserve and collects 1% interest, I would probably use that to pay towards lowering the debt that we would want to go and borrow. And then in essence, I would probably look at taking whatever the remaining balance is. So if it was a $3.5 million borrowing authorization, and we think we can get roughly 350,000 from reserves, roughly 292,000 from the annual budgeted reserve line item, that would leave about 2.9 million. I would recommend we bond $1.5 million, and that would therefore in 2 years, to that point that Meredith made, it would come back basically to the same level of debt service that we're at now. So we'd be at an elevated level for 2 years, then back to now our debt service level. And we would take the remaining balance from the unreserved funds, which would be 1.4 million. That's logical. I'll give you the exact dollar amounts of where and from where, what, but does that make sense to you all? Where are you at on the debt versus utilization of reserves? I'll go around the horn. Amanda, you're up in mine.
My concern was that we have enough left in reserves if any of the various opportunities we've been discussing or hoping for years, that we could be opportunistic if that took place. And so that was my question, and it's been answered already. Cool.
So you're in the line of a split, or you're okay with some debt, but not depleting all reserves as a general categorization. Meredith?
I'm in agreement with Amanda.
Ed?
I want to thank everybody for the clarity of the presentation, and as long as we have significant reserves, I think your plan is a very good one.
Al?
The spread of 4% a year between the deposit rate and the borrowing rate pushes me in a line of using as much as paying off as much of the potential debt as we can. I'd like to get the 3.5 million down to $1 million, $1.5 million, and then not bond that only. And if we could go lower, I would be in favor of that.
Appreciate that. Jim?
I agree with what you recommended, actually. That would be good.
Sounds good. So I guess, Wendy, if you want to model live a little bit quickly, if
Yes,
we
can
took,
you see my screen?
we can.
I switched to Excel.
Yeah,
from
we
PowerPoint.
gotcha. So if you take the borrowing authorization down from 3.5 million to 1.5 million, and then the unreserved fund balance would be $2 million utilized. The annual budgeted reserve would go down, I think.
So you could make that, want to just make that 0?
You could,
Yes.
if you want to do simple math, just while we're here, if you want to make it, if you want to take 275,000 of it, or just make it 0 and reduce the 2 million borrowing by that amount, I think was the way we would do it, right? Yeah, exactly.
So, I mean, we could just adjust the unreserved, how much you use from unreserved fund balance.
I'm sorry, that's what I meant, the unreserved fund balance. And so, team, it looks like we're using 2.558 million. The two things I would say, and that's a meaningful amount of, quote unquote 6.2, 6.3. But we are going to add, most likely, we're going to add one thing back. We're going to look to add $358,000 of inactive or complete project funds back into our unreserved balance. And two, we're going to look to use the $600,000 projected surplus to to add back to the unreserved fund balance as well. So in my mind, and please, Wendy, team, correct me if I'm wrong, but we're going to show 2.6 million going out, but roughly 600, 358, so 960 coming in. So it's really the net of those two, which is about 1.6 million and change. And I feel like that 1.6 million doesn't deplete the reserve balance too much, and it helps us keep the incremental debt to a moderate level of 1.5 million.
If I could jump in here,
please.
Just I don't do numbers, but from a political point of view, one of the big questions that always comes up in the public and sometimes at town meeting is, why do we keep such a large reserve? And I think this is a year that helps explain that. Al has pointed out there's a huge split between the amount of money we get by savings, or the lack of money we get by savings, versus the amount of money we can save by not bonding things. And that's the reason that we've kept this reserve. It works out very well as a simple explanation for town meeting.
Well said.
That begs the question, is it worth considering taking that last 1.5 million that were potential bonding and reducing the 4.6, we'd have $3 million or a full year's revenue if we paid off the whole playground from existing funds and reserve funds. Still if it's a big project, you're going to bond it probably anyway. So this way we're putting ourselves in good financial condition. We keep the borrowing rate lower, or the total borrowings lower, and we save 4% on every dollar that we don't bond per year. So I guess I'm in favor of not earning 1% and paying out 5%. That's from a treasurer's standpoint.
The only non-fiscal reason for borrowing is they can't vote the CPA out of business while we still have outstanding debt, which is why we've always maintained a certain amount of obligations for the future. But I see your point, Al, and I would ask the more financially aware people whether reducing our fund balance to around $3 million is safe. And if it is, maybe we should consider that.
It's a full year of revenue. So I think, that's significant. And if you do have some big projects, those you're going to have to, bond down the road. But at least we've set ourselves up in a good financial position to do some larger ones if and when they come up.
I think it's a fair point. I'll let the rest of the team, if anybody wants to make more thoughts, and then I'm happy to share mine.
I like bringing in more than we pay out.
In the sense of, just so
What
I
Al
understand.
said. Yeah, what Al said.
Yeah, I mean, look, it makes pure, when you look at it in a vacuum, financial sense to me. It's not complicated. It's 5 points, 1 point in. However, cutting our reserve fund in half. So to me, the larger exercise, Al, is not whether or not 1 year is valuable, but whether or not the value of the priority parcels that we'd have to definitely borrow against would equate and be substantiated by the $3 million you have on hand. Meaning, if I want to buy a $100,000 house, I got to have 20 grand in my pocket. But if we want to, if all of a sudden some of the priority tracks that come up that have been on our CPC plan, then having 3 million would not afford you the latitude and flexibility to go out and bond those.
Yeah, and we've been engaged in substantive discussions about some of the highest priority parcels that there are, and there would be a significant cost associated with those. So I 100% hear what you're saying, but my concern would be that we would be being penny wise and pound foolish if we think there's a realistic possibility of actually acquiring some of these priority parcels, or many of these priority parcels.
So I can see. Oh, go ahead, Jim.
I would point out that the interest rates are likely going to be higher next year than they are this year as well. And I would like to see that $1.5 million bonded.
Does it make sense? And again, I'm the least likely person to understand any of this. Would it make sense in keeping a reserve to do this financial trick again when the amount of money we can get on a deposit might be 1% and the interest rate might be 7%? We would be actually saving even more next year.
Yep. Yeah, I think what we're getting at is that maintaining some degree of savings enables you to have flexibility to withstand future price increases, or to purchase future, or I guess fund future projects is the way to say it, more easily because you have the savings in hand. So I think it's an incredibly valid vote. To me, I believe valid point. I believe we reflected it in taking basically 1/3, maybe just a little bit less than 1/3 of our reserves, engaging in some funding at an elevated rate. So I feel like we're balancing a few masters that are at opposite ends.
I also just add, it would be my recommendation that you borrow the $1.5 million. Now, I did projections based on 15 years. You don't have to bond for 15 years. You could bond for 5 years or 10 years, and that would cut down your interest cost as well, and still give you maybe a little breathing room to, accumulate, to build that fund balance back up again after a few years of getting, the state trust fund distributions, and more interest payments from Shovelworks.
I appreciate that, Wendy. I think if we're consistent with our practices and we've gone down this path really far, predicated upon the assumptions of the 15-year and the value of that dollar amount, unless you are able to demonstrate meaningful difference in the interest rate savings that you have handy now, I'm not sure the team's equipped, and I'm certainly not, to adjust on the fly, nor do I don't need to. But it's okay to raise, I think, options. We just want to know as long as we have the answers of what those options are, that way the team can engage. Otherwise, we may have to put the vote off if you thought it was material enough to raise it, to quantify it for us.
Can I jump in for a sec?
Sure.
Something that I've heard for the entirety of me being on this board is something that I really like, and that is to always be mindful of what might come down the pipeline for us, kind of looking to the future and adding an element of conservatism in what we do to make sure that we're mindful for something that might come up. And I've heard that tonight too. And I like that approach, hearing multiple ways of doing it. And I'm not an accountant either. I'm not a treasurer, never have been. But I think that is something that we should be mindful of in ultimately whatever we decide and how we get there. But there are things that could come up in the future, and I would just hate for us, and it doesn't sound like we're going to do that, but for us to put us in any type of a compromising position so that we couldn't address or handle something that came up. That would be, I think, devastating to our board, and for what I've heard over the last 10 years from our board here.
Appreciate that. Team, any final thoughts? New comments? All right, hearing none. Looking at Wendy's screen, I'll just rattle it off, but I would take a motion to fund Article 13, administrative expenses in debt service from our revenue existing revenues, I guess I'd call it. Anticipated revenues. Fund Article 14 from our anticipated revenues, which is the Affordable Housing Trust. Fund Article 15 from a blend of revenues of 228,430 and historic reservation. Wendy, how would I word that?
Oh, it's historic, fund balance reserve for historic resources.
Got it. Of 47,570. To fund Article 16, Swiss Park Design from anticipated revenues. To fund the Article 18 from, which is the tennis and basketball courts, from anticipated revenues. To fund the Town Hall Landscape Rehabilitation Plan from the remaining article balance of $60,000. Is that said the right way? I hope. And then to fund the playground from a blend of anticipated revenues in the amount of $291,735, leveraging the unreserved fund balance of $1,708,265, authorizing bonding for debt of $1.5 million. And I was remiss on the basketball courts. We would also use unreserved funds in the amount of $850,000. So I would take a motion to do all that.
So move, Lee.
Second, Benson.
That's Lee and Benson. Going around the horn, Amanda,
Aye.
Meredith,
Aye.
Ed,
Aye.
Al,
Aye.
Jim,
Aye.
and Tom is an aye as well. So I think we did all of the confirmation of funding sources. Stephanie, Wendy, Wayne, did I miss anything on those? Nope. Wendy, as always, literally invaluable with what you do and how you support us. Can't thank you enough. Ed said it best, but just always incredibly prepared. You give us options. You help us understand context around the decisions we make, and you are a financial guru. So we really appreciate you.
Thank you.
Would you mind sharing this, Wendy, with Stephanie, who can distribute it to everybody? And that way we can all have the presentation you gave tonight? Sweet. Awesome. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
We do have team 2 articles. The Article 12, I believe, the reserve of additional FY 2023 community preservation funds. This article is to see if the town will vote in accordance with the recommendation of the CPC to reserve for later appropriation additional monies from available community preservation funds for the following purposes: $14,804 for open space recreation, $14,804 for historic resources, $14,804 for community housing. By way of explanation, the Community Preservation Fund received supplemental state trust funding in an amount of $148,044 in January 2023. $14,804 would be 10%, which is our required amount to allocate to those particular items. So with that, I would take a motion to include and recommend Article 12, reserving additional community preservation funds.
So moved.
Second, Lee.
Hands in Lee. Going around the horn, Jim,
Aye.
Al,
Aye.
Ed,
Aye.
Meredith,
Aye.
Amanda.
Aye.
Tom Broussard is an aye. The second item is the CPA's fiscal year 24 budget article for the 2023 annual town meeting. What article number is that? Is that the Article 13 report and fiscal year budget of the, that's what it is.
Yes, it's, yes.
I'm sorry, Article 13. It was the report that got me. So Article 13, and everybody should have these in their email. So if I'm reading it quick, don't feel like you have to make notes. You should have it. But to see if the town will vote to act on the report, the CPC, fiscal year 2024, community preservation budget, to appropriate a reserve for later appropriation monies from the community preservation fund, annual revenues or available funds for the administrative expenses of the CPC, payment of debt service, the undertaking of community preservation projects, and all other necessary and proper expenses for the year, or take any other action relative thereto. The proposed fiscal year 2024 community preservation budget is comprised of the $111,750 administrative expenses, debt service in the amount of $601,585. There will be no allocation to the annual budgeted reserve of $291,735, given we just allocated that for use live against the school project. So is it okay to accept Article 13 with the amendment to remove the annual budgeted reserve of $291,735? Is that Wayne and Stephanie the appropriate way to say?
Yes.
Great. So I will take a motion to approve Article 13 and recommend report and fiscal year 2024 budget of the Community Preservation Committee with the edit to remove the annual budgeted reserve in the amount of $291,735.
So move, Lee.
Second, Benson.
Lee and Benson going around the horn. Amanda?
Aye.
Meredith?
Aye.
Ed?
Aye.
Al?
Aye.
Jim?
Aye.
Tom is an aye. I think that takes care of all of the major items. One item left. Wayne, do you want to talk to us a little bit about the fiscal year 25 grant round planning applications, May 2024 annual town meeting?
Happy to. This is a quick check-in on an assumption, and hopefully a future meeting can have a deeper conversation about if how and if we can improve the process. I'm imagining that next year will resemble last year in our approach of a letter of interest in spring, working with staff and CPC members on the near final draft application for mid-fall, final application late fall for a CPC vote to recommend in the middle of winter, the sort of December, January range. Basically just what we've done again. So if we are assuming a process similar to that, now is the month we need to advertise that we are accepting letters of interest. And this would be the same template that we used last year. It's just a very quick information about who you are and a quick one pager of what your project might be. And this will allow staff to advise and CPC to determine if it's an eligible expense and if it's something that they feel moved to invite to apply, similar to what we did last year. So I just wanted to check in on that assumption before we start advertising that we have, we're opening up letters of interest now.
Letters of interest did used to go out in August, correct? And we moved it now to
No, letters of interest is a new thing.
Mm-hmm.
So what we did, we were finding that the CPA application process had gotten very bogged down and cluttered with all sorts of caveats and legal language and 3-page addendums about Secretary of Interior standards. And it wasn't actually producing better applications. And people would just kind of wait to the last minute and then throw everything at us, with 3 weeks notice. So this process is basically a year-long application process. People come in very early in the year, let us know what they're thinking. And as we found this past round, several were not actually eligible. So they didn't move forward. It allowed several months for applicants to conclude that perhaps now is not a time for them to actually submit an application at the library with Drew. So this is what we did last year with a letter of interest in spring, working over the summer, and then a good solid draft application in fall.
Right. If I could add to that, it really helped. I think we saw that it really helped the application process, that we're giving feedback early, either whether a project might be eligible or might not be eligible, but as well what is needed to complete the application and fill it out and make sure it's in good shape when they submit the draft.
I thought it was a great process this year, bringing the applicants along the ride with us from letter of interest all the way through initial draft app to final apps. It felt smooth, but I really would ask for your opinion, especially those that have been on the committee for a period of time. This was my first year rodeo. So if it went well from your perspective overall as compared to prior years, or was good, then that sounds great. But if it was a step back from prior years and there's ways to improve, there's always time to look at that as well.
Well, I think Stephanie and Wayne do a magnificent job of keeping us somewhat insulated from the difficulties that you endure. So thank you for that.
I think, go ahead, Jim.
I think it's a big step forward. I think a lot of it was Wayne's idea. So I give you a lot of credit for that, and it paid out.
I think we went from having a adversarial kind of a approach where the proponent came in and tried to convince us to give up our money to one that's been very cooperative. So I heartily agree that last year was really a big improvement. And by starting in the spring, what Meredith was referring to earlier about August that's when the beginning of the process was back in the olden days, and that squished everything together in a very short time frame.
That seemed weird. How we're doing it now definitely feels much better. That's for sure.
Yep, absolutely.
Am I now part of the olden days, Ed?
Yeah.
I'd never say that.
I think there's your answer, Wayne. So it sounds like we're good to go to start the process the same. Team, I would ask that, so for next meeting, I think there's 2 items I'd just like to get your thoughts on. One would be to really think about and strategize what we would look for in 2025. Like, are there areas that we're aware of as a team? Do we want to solicit any areas that we believe might need support? Certainly can reach out to the chairs of the other departments. So for example, I'll reach out to Nikki Dostumian to talk about affordable housing, to understand if they may have some bigger projects coming up, or if they have any thoughts on applications. But we could do that with certainly all of the mandated components we have to cover, like rec space, for example, open space, Meredith, and certainly historical preservation if there are projects there. So I'd love to have just a little bit of a brainstorming strategy session for our next meeting, just so that we can ideate a little bit about and maybe reflect upon some of our priorities in our plan and see where they might be, just to have a little bit of a refresher for all of us. And then the other thing would be, I'd love to, Al's been incredibly patient, but he, Stephanie, and Wayne did some great work on the list of projects that are complete or inactive. And I would just like to run the rest of the team through it, rather than just assuming we would take the funds and put them into the unreserved fund. I just want you all to be aware of it, to have knowledge about it, and to be aligned with that action. So I'd love to at least have those 2 things on the next meeting. So it's a little bit more looking ahead now that we've got most of the FY24 items behind us. Steph, Wayne, is there any housekeeping items we want to make sure we have on next agenda that still relate to this year that we still have to do? I feel like we're done with most of the items for this coming year.
I think that's it, but I do want to, unless I really missed it, I think we still have one housekeeping item for this meeting. Did you vote on the minutes to accept the minutes? Wow, that was fast.
It's an efficient bunch.
Don't mess around.
Okay.
Tom, will you be speaking to the Affordable Housing Commission after the next meeting or before?
So probably just in due course. So I'm not, to me, if you need me to do it before, I can make sure I do that. But in what I'm getting at is, you know, we have three major components that we're tasked with supporting: open space, historical,
Right.
and affordable housing. And so, you know, in my mind, while you don't treat all kids equal all the time, there may be just considerations that some of them have larger projects that are coming up in their particular 3 or 5 year plan. And the fact that the sooner we can figure that out, the more supportive a role we may be able to play, or we may be able to inform their process a little bit if it conflicts with something else that's a priority of ours.
Yep.
Did you want me to speak with them before the next
What
meeting?
I'd like to throw out is for consideration is that we give some consideration to additional funds for affordable housing for the specific purpose of putting photovoltaics, and then look at ground source heat or split ground regular heat pumps. There's a new version out that has a very high coefficient of energy. And those two things, if they wrap that into the housing per se, might help the people that are in, because it would be reducing electrical costs, it would be reducing heating and cooling costs. They would, in essence, go into upfront capital. Plus, we would be making those buildings almost zero emissions.
So I guess what I'll do, Al, is I'll ask you, if you don't mind, to send an email. I think Steph and Wayne, we probably have to hunt down. Can CPC funds be used to?
I think I saw Wayne raising his hand, and
Yeah,
I think that, yeah, I'm.
Yeah,
We'll go into affordable housing and trying to make it more cost efficient for the borrower.
So two points. For capital improvements to a house, it has to be restricted affordable. There has to be an affordability restriction on it.
Right.
So that's a very limited pool of housing in Easton that would apply for. But there may be, switching this around a little bit, what about the housing authority? You know, would the housing authority be interested in solar and heat pumps and such? You know, that might be a place to really move the needle on that.
So Wayne, you're saying you think that if the housing authority was looking for that type of funding, for funding for those type of improvements to their existing,
Yeah,
or
I think
in the construction.
that would qualify.
You know, I was thinking if they do some construction, grassroots construction, that might be the most advantageous place to look at, because now you're not putting in an oil unit and replacing it down the road. You're doing the heat pump and photovoltaics initially.
And by the way,
I'm thinking about retrofit.
Yeah, I think I speak for Wayne and for the Affordable Housing Trust. The idea of providing funding for those type of improvements and repairs is one that we think is needed and would be great. It's just that you have that restricted requirement that they have to be restricted.
But I thought I heard something different, which was not in retrofitting, but to the extent they have new projects to ensure that they're as environmentally friendly
That's what I was looking
as
at.
possible.
Oh, okay. So that you're thinking that
If they build some new buildings, that those could be, you know, we try to make those zero emissions. It's the town's one step that the town can do in trying to reduce, you know, climate change.
Wayne, why don't you and I talk about that a little bit, because that there may be a way to do that. There may be a way.
If I can help on costs, you know, let's say the ground source heat pumps or photovoltaics, and we can probably get some grants from Mass Save that might support, you know, low income affordable housing, that would be worth, picking up as a unit. Maybe we can get them to do both.
Sounds good. So I can definitely raise it when I talk to him now, and I may very well put you in direct contact.
Okay, if you want.
To give them the idea. Yep.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Does that make sense? If anybody else has items for next meeting's agenda, so I guess a lot of our hard work has been done. Would love to get a little bit more work done. I think, do we normally take any months off in the summer? Does this team normally do that?
It really has, I think, depended, again, when the old schedule timeline for applications kind of left the summer months a little light for meeting, and not they weren't necessarily held, but more recently where there have been, again, it's kind of a year-long process. It's really up to you and the board.
So if we could add a third topic for next week's meeting, then it would just be meeting schedule cadence. And what we might do is just be thoughtful of everybody's time, efforts, and contributions to this committee. And maybe there's a month or maybe two in the summer that we don't necessarily plan a meeting. Like July is usually a busy vacation month. But we can just make that for a discussion topic for next week as well.
Do we have to start meeting? Not that I'm averse to this, but do we have to start meeting in person? Someone had reached out to me and indicated that may be a rule.
So the current status is that, again, I believe hybrid meetings where, some members can attend a meeting remotely if there's going to be a quorum issue or something like that, although you have to have a quorum in person. That's already in play, but the ability to continue to hold remote meetings, which was part of the COVID emergency declarations, is set to expire finally the end of the month. There is legislation before the House and the Senate that would allow towns to hold either remote meetings, hybrid meetings, or in-person meetings, or a combination thereof. We don't know what the current status is. I know that the Senate was meeting on it last week for discussion. I don't know where it's gone. I know there's a lot of support for it from the municipal community. And a lot of the reasoning is because we've seen an increase in public participation. I hear that from all my colleagues in municipal work. And we have been able to keep certain board members longer because it's more flexible for their schedules. Meredith, you're a great example. You have attended meetings from all kinds of locations, and I know how difficult that would be to get to a meeting if you had to do that in person. So
absolutely, it's been a great benefit for me, for my family, and my involvement. What does hybrid look like?
The Calling Corona room is set up for hybrid meetings, and can be used. I think the select board has had one meeting and it seemed to go well. So right now, to the best of my knowledge, the town has one room for municipal meetings that's set up for the hybrid.
So one predominant group could attend in person, and then other folks could attend remotely.
Right.
Have it simultaneously.
Yeah.
Got it. Thank you.
I think they've only done a couple. I think ECAT was scrambling the last one when Jamie, I believe, was remote. And but yeah.
Yeah, but it went pretty well. I actually watched some of the recording.
Yeah, I think from the outside it looked okay, but I think the inside it was a lot.
We've tried to do it with my team, and it can be somewhat chaotic. So I'd be curious to see how it rolls out.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is just skills building for staff. So add to the list. And then one final item. So it's Thursday the 13th at 7 p.m. would be this meeting, whether in person or remote. And we're meant to be talking about, the outstanding balances. And a reminder for Tom and Stephanie and Al, I believe our next quarterly meeting about these is Tuesday, April 4 at 8 a.m. So that's what I have on my calendar. So that'll allow the working group to update its own self and be able to have a more informed conversation on the 13th.
Can you run those dates again one more time? I'm sorry.
Absolutely. The one that's relevant for everyone here is Thursday, April 13 at 7 p.m. That's the next CPC meeting. Technically, right now it's in person someplace, unless they get their act together on the legislation and we can continue doing it remote. And then what is not germane to anyone except Tom, Stephanie, Al, myself is Tuesday, April 4 at 8 a.m. We've got a quarterly meeting that we have to chase down these outstanding project balances from old projects. Some are active, some are never going to be active again. So.
Appreciate everybody's help, support. Anybody else have any last minute comments before we make a motion to adjourn? Nope. I will take a motion to adjourn.
Move to adjourn.
Second.
It's Amanda and Jim Lee going around the horn. Jim?
Aye.
Al?
Aye.
Ed?
Aye.
Meredith?
Aye.
Amanda?
Aye.
And I am also an aye. So thank you so much, Wayne, Stephanie, Wendy, Kathy. Thank you as always for joining and keeping track for all of us. So I hope everybody has a great month. Hope there is very little snow and we're talking spring the next time we get to meet.
The snow is heavy in spring.
Well said, Jim. Well said. Bye, team. Stay safe.
All right. Good night,
Thanks, everyone.
everybody.
Night.